Hi, I'm Danny,
Hi, I'm Mel.
and we're the Sheehan sisters. If you haven't seen our faces before, we like to do podcast and commentary style videos on different topics we like to talk about.
Yes, so as always, grab your coffee, tea, water, your beverage of choice, grab some snacks, get cozy because we have a lot to talk about today.
I have Theo's Mets mug for my coffee today.
I have this cute little watermelon cup.
That is cute. Perfect for the summer.
Yes.
How are you getting through this summer heat?
Um, I'm I'm okay, I guess. I work in a kitchen, so I'm constantly surrounded by heat. So I think my tolerance for heat has gone up. But luckily in Seattle, there has been a few heat waves. But for the most part, the summers here are really nice because it definitely doesn't get as hot as New York does. And the humidity isn't, I think, it's not as bad as New York summer. How are you doing?
I've been staying in the AC, super grateful, but yeah, the humidity has been bad. It tends to affect my asthma, but just trying to stay healthy. It's been a while since we filmed because we've had a shitty month of June.
Yes, Danny's been dealing with some personal things.
Yes. So our book review for the month of June is a bit late this time. I think one of our other reviews we filmed pretty late as well. I don't remember if that was The Bluest Eye.
Yeah, we're trying our best to stay on top of things, but life does get in the way sometimes. And as we always mention, we do have just our normal jobs that we have to get to and focus on, and just other things in life.
Yes.
But we're trying our best, and we're still gonna bring you a book review for the book of the month.
We're trying our best. We know we don't have as many active members of our book reviews, but I think this has been very beneficial to Mel and I.
Yeah, I was gonna say at the end of the day, we're doing it for ourselves first and foremost, but we do hope that some of you out there are joining along with us.
Absolutely. And I say this in all of our reviews, but I think that there's something you can learn and take away from these episodes, even if you haven't read the book. Of course, we always encourage you to go ahead and support these authors and just learn more, keep your brain active. If you're looking for new things to read and you're not sure where to start, use our episodes as some guidance.
Yes, our book for the month of June was All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. It was a memoir of their childhood through college years. And we may have mentioned this in past videos, but all the books that we have read and will continue to read this year have been books that are banned. I think maybe the only book that
Most of the books we chose were banned or are banned books, but we do have a few in there that aren't on the banned list.
so far, I think the only one that hasn't been on the banned list was Crying in H Mart, but I think all the other books we read so far have been banned in some capacity.
Yes, I do think some we have upcoming. There's maybe like two more that aren't on the banned list.
Possibly, we'll confirm that. Yeah.
We are doing our book review for All Boys Aren't Blue, but since we are talking about our book club, we want to let you all know that for the month of July, we are reading George Orwell's 1984, which I know was part of the curriculum, right? You read it in high school?
No, this book I've never read, which I'm excited to. I've never read this one.
I never read either, but I feel like it was something most people were introduced to during their school years.
I know another book by George Orwell, which is Animal Farm. A lot of people have read that one in school. Maybe 1984 was one. But I think just like The Catcher in the Rye and Fahrenheit 451, since so much has changed in the curriculum, I think that has made its way onto the banned list, just like those other two books that I just mentioned. But I haven't read it, and I'm excited to read it because I've been wanting to read that book. And a lot of books I have been rereading in this series. So I'm always excited when it's a book I have yet to read.
There's a siren going off. I'm gonna let that pass because even when we have the mics, those sirens still get picked up just as loudly. I haven't read 1984 either, but I do know a little bit about it, and I'm sure it will be more prevalent than ever, like most of the books we've been reading. And on that note, let me pull up because I sent Mel a post that I saw recently. Let me find it. I've posted a few resources from this channel. It's called Now This Is Impact. A few days ago, they posted that Dua Lipa built a shrine to the books America keeps trying to ban. And it says Dua Lipa opened a library for banned and censored books. The Manifesto Library is a partnership between Dua Lipa's Service 95 book club and Portugal's historic Livaria. Hopefully I said that right. Portugal's historic Livaria Lelo bookshop. It holds a permanent collection of 100 books organized around 4 themes: power, control, voice, and memory. The collection includes titles banned by U.S. school districts for themes of race, books restricted because of LGBTQIA plus themes, and works by authors who were prosecuted for their writing. While American school boards keep stripping books off shelves, Dua Lipa built something permanent for the books they don't want you to read. And of course, I made a little joke. I was like, oh, when Dua Lipa does it, the whole world claps, but when Mel and I do it, we get 10 views.
We did it first, so we just want to make that very clear. No, I love that, and that's definitely something Danny and I want to do in the future as well. We want to make books more accessible to everyone. And
the main reason we started this book club, not only because we wanted to continuously educate ourselves in the height of brain rot, we wanted to dedicate most of this year's list to banned books, which is why we're reading All Boys Are in Blue, or we read it. We did read it.
And we did read it, we promise.
This is the second most banned book in America. Wild.
Yeah. And I just want to read. Are we going to start? We're going to get into it?
Let's jump on into it.
So I want to read a part from the author's note at the beginning, just to give a little insight into what the book is about. Hopefully some of you have gotten the chance to read it. I will say it was hard for me to find a copy of this book. I try to go to smaller bookshops, local bookshops, used bookshops. I think because it is a newer book, it was a little harder to find. And the author says, they mention how there's going to be heavy subjects in the book, and then they go on to say this book will touch on sexual assault, including molestation, loss of virginity, homophobia, racism, and anti blackness. These discussions at times may be a bit graphic, but nonetheless, they are experiences that many reading this book will encounter or have already encountered. And I want those readers to be seen and heard in these pages. And they also go on to say a lot of the language that will also be used within this book. And I just wanted to give that warning because obviously, if we're discussing this book, we're also going to be discussing the topics at hand as well. And so, George talks about their life and their experience as a queer Black person in America. And it was a very eye opening book. And if you haven't read it, I definitely recommend that you go and you read it. And I think, again, Danny and I always say, as white women, we want to do our part in platforming voices that matter. And although this book was not written for us, we still find it important to read it and to learn from it and to spread the word. And whenever we are preaching, we are only preaching to the white people because it's not our place to be telling anyone else anything. So we just want to encourage more white people to read books from other perspectives. Yeah.
Yes. And prior to the author's note, there was a forward, and George mentions an author we read earlier this year, which was Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. So I did want to read that paragraph before we jump into our analysis. My favorite author, Toni Morrison, called her first novel The Bluest Eye. Looking back 4 years, maybe my choice to include blue in the title of this book was some ancestral magic at play. But my eyes have never been blue. I know the significance of being born in this country with blonde hair and blue eyes, straight and male. My eyes are brown. The only blue that comes from them are tears. Tears when I cry because I'm sad. Tears when I'm happy and filled with joy. My hair is black and I am non-binary. I don't fit in the boxes of privilege, but I deserve to be here and flourish and thrive. And for those of you who do have privilege in this world, spend it. Share it with those who don't have it. Equalize the playing field. Build bridges, not walls. Help one another. Form a coalition of equality and equity. Protect the queer persons in your life. Fight for Black folks and Latinx folks and all people of color. You have the power to change things. Don't use that power to oppress. Mel and I were watching an interview from George, and they mentioned another quote by Toni Morrison, which we've mentioned in our book review when we read The Bluest Eye, which was, if there's a book that you want to read but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And that's something we learned from Toni Morrison, was that she felt that there weren't enough stories that represented who she was and her experiences. So she felt the need to write those stories so that that representation is seen. And I believe George felt the same way and felt that they needed to get their story out there to help many other people out there who don't feel seen and heard.
And I did see a lot of parallels between this book and The Bluest Eye. And the main difference being that this book is a memoir and The Bluest Eye was a fiction novel, even though it was based on a lot of reality. But I do find, for myself anyway, when it's fiction, it's easier to detach yourself from it and be like, okay, it's just a book, it's fine. And then it's different when you know that this is someone's actual life and experiences. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
There were parts of the Blue Side that were super hard to read, but I think it just helped me get through it to be like, even though I know that what was happening in the book happens in real life, like it was easier to detach myself from it. And also thinking about, okay, maybe this specific character doesn't exist, but someone out there like this does exist.
Right. I'm pulling up my notes. I feel like I should put a light on because it's getting dark, but you know what? I'm feeling the gloominess. It's a very gloomy day in New York City.
But think about the editing.
I'll fix it in editing, like we do with everything else. So we get introduced to George, and they start by informing us about their birth and how their aunt mistakenly thought that they were a girl initially and ran out of the hospital room to tell the family it's a girl. But then she went back into the room and realized it's a boy. So George introduces their relationship to gender and identity from that story, right? And they talk about how gender and identity is pushed upon you before you're even born. And I wanted to read a section from that introduction. This is on page 3. When our gender is assigned at birth, we are also assigned responsibilities to grow and maneuver through life based on the simple checking off of those boxes: male, female, black, white, straight, gay. Kids who don't fit the perfect boxes are often left asking themselves what the truth is. Am I a girl? Am I a boy? Am I both? Am I neither? As a child, I struggled mightily with these questions, and that struggle continued to show up in various ways throughout my life. Now, as an adult, I have a much better grasp of sexuality, gender, and the way society pressures us to conform to what has been the norm. I understand how this sense of normality doesn't hold a space for those of us who don't fit the aesthetic of what a boy or girl should be, or how a man or woman should perform. Unfortunately, we are still struggling to move the conversation past an assumed identity at birth. And LGBTQIAP+ people are not just fighting for the right to self-identity and be accepted in a society that is predominantly composed of two genders, which would be the bare minimum of acceptance. We are also fighting to survive physical acts of violence. Many of us are not even surviving that. The spectrum of our traumas can be as broad as our identities. I'm going to read a little bit more, and then we can get into one of their pivotal moments as a child. I started writing this book with the intention that every chapter would end with solutions for all the uncomfortable or confusing life circumstances I experienced as a gay Black child in America. I quickly learned this book would be about so much more, about the overlap of my identities and the importance of sharing how those intersections create my privilege and my oppression. Many of us carry burdens from the traumas of our past, and they manifest in our adulthood. We all go through stages of accepting or struggling with our various identities, gay, straight, or non-identifying. And race and various other factors play a role in how we navigate them. Many of us are always in a state of working through something, always in a state of becoming a more aware version of self. This book is an exploration of two of my identities, Black and queer, and how I became aware of their intersections within myself and in society. How I've learned that neither of those identities can be contained within a simple box, and that I enter the room as both of them despite the spaces and environments I must navigate. In the white community, I am seen as a Black man first, but that doesn't negate the queer identity that will still face discrimination. In the Black community, where I more often find myself, It is not the black male identity that gets questioned immediately. It is that intersection with queerness that is used to reduce my blackness and the overall image of black men. Because this is a memoir, I'm sharing some of my personal memories with you. So we get introduced to George as a young kid who's walking home from school with their cousins, and there was a group of kids who end up bullying George and their cousins. And we find out that one of them ends up kicking George in the face and they lose their teeth, which marked an introduction to trauma that affected George throughout their life and navigating that trauma and understanding why it happened and how that affected their development.
This experience obviously heavily impacted George. As you mentioned, they lost their teeth, and even though they're a kid and their adult teeth are going to grow in, that still impacted how they view themselves, and they struggled with the way that they looked after that.
Right. So I wanted to read a section on page 28 through 29, if you want to pull that up. So at the bottom of the page, George says, "There were no counselors or therapy sessions to help me work through what had happened. Therapy is still very much a taboo subject in the Black community. Those who are seen as having issues with their mental health face a lot of stigma and discrimination because mental health is often conflated with mental illness. So rather than having their child labeled as something hurtful, my parents did the best they could with what they knew. We did what we always did as a family. We loved on each other even harder. In that moment, my mother just held me, and we sat there together for a long while. Eventually, she took me home, but the next day became just that, the next day. What happened the day before was to be forgotten, or better yet, buried."
And I think that that's a theme we've seen in multiple other stories as well, where a traumatic event happens, and a lot of the time the narrator states how they just have to go on, and that's unfortunately one of the rough parts of life, where there really is no solution in the moment other than to just keep moving forward and then carrying on, whether you have to go to school, to work, whatever it may be. Though society doesn't give us the chance to just stop and process the trauma, and growing up in certain families, it's not always given the option, like they mentioned, to seek out a counselor or a therapist. Although throughout this book, George does mention having a really strong family unit. So at least they did have that aspect of it, where they had a mother that was caring and did take into consideration that moment.
George does have a great support system, which we learn throughout the book, but that doesn't take away from the trials and tribulations that they went through.
Of course.
And then on page 30, they mention that every now and again, my mom will find a picture of me with my teeth showing. There aren't many of them, though, and when I look at them, sometimes I cringe. Other times, I've actually teared up, wondering if I was truly happy in that picture, or if I simply felt the need to smile because someone said, "Smile, Matt," and I obliged. The fact that I don't feel happy when I look at those images lets me know there wasn't any happiness when I took them. What did I look like to others? A child who rarely smiled? Did they ever take it as a sign that I was actually dealing with a trauma I couldn't get past? Or did they pass it off as a quote unquote boys will be boys thing that I would eventually grow out of? To go years without smiling in pictures, rarely being questioned why, leaves me to wonder how many signs of trauma we miss or ignore in Black children. And I think that was important for George to mention because, as we stated, this was a pivotal traumatic moment in their life that still to this day they can vividly remember, and it still affects them, and it shaped really who they became. And to continue from this page, George writes, Black boys are required to be rough and tough, to suck up the pain and not shed a tear. If you get into a fight, you better win the fight, or I'ma beat your ass when you get home, is a phrase I've heard too many times from friends and family throughout my life. Being Black and queer brings on layers of issues. And I think this also began their many questions of their identity and their relationship to masculinity, which we see is a theme throughout the book. As George continues to go to school and is learning what they like and what they don't like, we see another pivotal moment in George's life where all they want to do is play double dutch at recess, but then all the other boys are questioning, not really questioning, but kind of making fun of George, right, for being interested in double dutching.
That's an experience I'm sure a lot of people can relate to, because society still hasn't pushed past those gender norms where you're a child and you're expected, well, this is girl things and this is boy things, and the girls can go and jump rope and hula hoop and play with dolls, and then the boys have to go and play sports. And I did mark some stuff on that page in that chapter where they talk about that. And that was another moment in their life where they had to make a decision to protect themselves and decide, how do I want to be viewed by other people?
I do want to backtrack after we talk a little bit about this, but we can continue on this discussion.
Okay.
Do you have a page for us to turn to?
Yes, 74.
You all know we like to jump around when we're doing our book reviews, so it's not always going to be in a linear order. We like to flip back and forth.
We tried our best this time, but I guess I jumped ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I jumped ahead. I think one difficulties I have when we do the book review is that I want what I'm saying to correlate to my next point. So sometimes I do end up jumping ahead because this relates to what I'm talking about in the moment.
Right.
And that's how you write an essay, people. It's getting so dark. I think I should put a light on.
So we are in the middle of page 74.
Ready?
Homophobia denies queer people happiness. I imagine there are a lot of queer people who would love to play sports or do traditionally masculine activities, but they hold themselves back based on the fear of interacting with people they can't trust. People who have made it very clear that queer people are unwelcome despite the fact they have talent. Homophobia is the reason that so many who currently play sports are closeted, as there is no way football, baseball, and basketball are 99.9% heterosexual. So I marked this page because George is seeing both sides to this, where they do feel more drawn to playing jump rope with the girls and being around the girls, but still having a part of them that wants to be accepted by the boys. And even though in this chapter they grow to actually enjoy playing football and playing sports and going on to play track, they still don't feel fully accepted. And I think, again, that's another major theme throughout the book of like not knowing where to go and where to find themselves. And that's something that people in the LGBTQIAP plus are facing every single day, because people are constantly telling them who they are and where they should go and what they should do. And I just think it's so interesting. Like, as I was reading this, I was like, yeah, wow, there really aren't openly gay athletes. And like, I don't really watch sports, but I'm aware of famous athletes. And it's like, again, that's something that it's 2026 and we don't, and more so male athletes or even male artists in other regards, where if they come out, it's like they're almost blacklisted as soon as they do come out.
And I think one of the overall themes is not having to fit into boxes. George mentions that they did get into sports, specifically track and field, and then now as an adult, they get made fun of for being a gay person who enjoys sports.
There's so many stereotypes for black people, for gay people, and again, people trying to say, well, this is what I think you should be. This is how I think you should act, and this is the things I think you should like. And again, as a society, we keep pushing, trying to get out of all of this. And it's interesting because as much as you try to break away from one box, people are so quick to build another one for you.
Right.
And I know a part of it is like human nature of like trying to understand things, but then pigeonholing people to that is where the fault lies.
That's what I was going to say. I think that society has an inability to be comfortable with the complexities of identity and gender, right? And if they don't fit a box, then so many people can't comprehend who that person is. And this is where we're like, no, like we all need to be more open-minded and let people experiment if they want to, or let people identify how they want to identify. If it's not harming you, why are you so affected by it? So many people are so uncomfortable with things that are different from who they are and how they identify that it ends up turning into anger. And we see that time and time again, and it's still so prevalent. Like we said, so many of these themes we read over and over again have not gone away. We still see this in modern times, where the queer community is being attacked and people are in hiding still, and people can't fully reveal who they are because they're scared for their lives. I wanted to go to that page where George mentions, was there anything else you wanted to read before I read something?
No, you can go forward.
When George played football with the boys, and they all realized that George is actually really good at football, and there was like 3 of the boys that couldn't tackle them, George got all this praise and acceptance. And they mentioned that it was one of the greatest days in their elementary school life because it was a moment that helped them understand that not only were they good at sports, but they could also use their talent as a shield from bullying. And that's another theme George talks about throughout the book, is having to conform to certain things so that they can survive, right? So that they don't get hurt. And we see, though, even when they find ways to conform or to hide, they still end up in harmful, dangerous situations. So George says, I was never picked first at recess, but I was also never picked last. That meant something to me. It meant that folks were looking past my femininity, which was a relief, even if for a moment. Back then, it was either that you sucked at whatever sport was being played, or that folks thought you weren't quote unquote manly enough, or as manly as a boy could be. The audacity of society to infuse manhood into a child's life. And I think that goes back to George discussing gender roles being placed on you before you're born. And it's ironic that a lot of the talking point against, the queer community, especially young kids who are still figuring out their identity, is just that kids be kids, right? And I think that you can argue that let kids be kids and learning who they are for themselves. Like George mentioned, why is there this pressure of what masculinity is already instilled into a young boy's life?
Right, and we see the similar theme in The Bluest Eye, where the girls are given the doll and are expected to care for the doll as if that's their child and already being forced into a motherly role. And it's just, yeah, it's just weird. It's like, why can't a little kid just jump rope without it being questioned? And we're hoping that we move into a world where we do just let kids be kids. Especially for Black children who are looked at as adults, even when they're still children. Like they're already put under so much more pressure, right, and viewed differently. And again, I'm gonna keep comparing this to The Bluest Eye because we see that in that book as well, where they're not ever really given the chance to be kids. And even like the character of Pacola, who has so much going on in her life and is expected to take on all this trauma and responsibility at a young age and is not viewed in the same lens as the other little girls are viewed. So I just see a similarity in that in George's childhood, where, like you said, they're already putting the pressure on being manly.
Right. So on page 80, George says, as an adult Black queer person, I now get teased for how into sports I am. It's always been a running joke that gays don't do sports, which is a lie in most circumstances. I don't have to be confined to an identity that boxes me into a space where I have to choose one or the other. To do so would just reward the homophobia. I can be good at football and double dutch. I'm actually still very good at football and double dutch. But most importantly, I'm not bound by either of them. You don't have to be either. I thought that was such a lovely way to wrap up that chapter. And do you think that, okay, this might be controversial. No, never mind. Because I was going to bring up a question that really doesn't add to the conversation, but we see it till this day, right? Where, yeah, most men who are athletes can't be openly gay or openly queer because that's still a toxic stigma put onto athletes. And then on the other hand, we see women constantly still being berated for even playing sports, where men don't even feel like women should be involved in sports whatsoever. So it's just, again, reinstating what society thinks a man and woman should be doing.
I truly believe there's a war on femininity, and I think that that's something we speak about often, being women, and we see it as, even in this book, where gay men are attacked and trans women are attacked, and anyone who has any sort of feminine identity gets the harsher end of the hatred. Not to say that trans men and lesbians aren't also dealing with their own struggles. It's just more often than not, we see more stories coming out of of someone who's choosing to be.
We live in the patriarchy,
feminine.
so of course masculinity is going to be more accepted than femininity.
So yeah, there are still women who get berated for playing sports, and yeah, it's just something I've noticed too, working in a more male-dominated field, where you can, and a lot of women probably feel this way, and that's something George talks about too with their gender identity, of conforming to what men want and feeling the need to act more masculine in certain settings. And even when a woman does enter a more male-dominated field, she can't enter it in a girly way. She can't enter it in an Elle Woods, type of way where she's wearing all the pink and she's being ultra feminine, because then you're not going to be taken seriously. So you almost have to bog yourself down to be a more masculine figure, or like they say, you can't beat them, join them. So you feel like, okay, I'm gonna just pretend and be one of the boys. And I know we said we jump around a lot, and like just to jump ahead a lot into the future, where George joins the fraternity to again feel more masculine, and there's the sense of the brotherhood. And yeah, I've noticed that, again, being in a more male dominated space, like this pressure to conform and, again, to just show more masculine traits, where they won't allow you to have the femininity and still be good at something that's considered masculine. I might have said that very like roundabout, but
We got your point. We get it.
thank you.
So we skipped a part that had a lot to do with George's identity as well, where they had a moment in their childhood where their cousin was telling them that their real name. So their family calls them Matthew, right? Matt, for most of their life, and then George ends up finding out that Matthew is their middle name, and then has this brief moment of, okay, do I want to go by George or do I want to go by Matt?
I found that part strange, because I do know some people who often go by their middle name more than their first name, but they're aware of what their full name is. So I was confused why their family kind of hid it from them. That was interesting to me.
I think they were saying that the mom and their nanny like didn't really like the name George.
Right, but to never tell the kid, hey, we're gonna call you by your middle name instead, is I can understand why they had that identity crisis for their name.
Right. So this is the point I wanted to make, right? Because George says on page at the bottom of page 49, your name is one of the most important pieces of your identity. It is the thing that you own. It is attached to every piece of work that you put into the world. Your name, sorry, my voice cracked. Your name holds power when you walk into a room. No two people with the same name are the same person. It's important that, like everything else you grow to love in life, your name is something you appreciate as well. Should you not like your name, change it. It is yours and it will stay with you forever. So do with it what you wish. As we continue to grow through sex and gender, many people will take back their power and change their names, choosing one that fits the person they are, not the one society pushed them to be. Keep your name if you like it, but know that you don't have to. The most important thing to realize is that you have the agency to make decisions that are in your best interest. The power to push back against society and even those in your own home. It is unfortunate that we live in a world where owning your agency could be met with rejection, disrespect, or even violence, especially for those owning their queer identity from a young age. Suffice it to say, respect people for their names and for how they choose to identify. This also goes for respecting people in their choice of pronouns. He, him, she, her, they, them, God, goddess, or whatever. We are conditioned to think these things should be the exception. People being allowed to be called by their chosen names and their gender pronouns is the rule. Let yourself unlearn everything you thought you knew about yourself, and listen to what you need to know about those who navigate life outside the margins of a heterosexual box. I bet most of you never thought to ever question if you even like your name, or question if that was something you had the power to change if you didn't. I hope you will now. And I thought that was such an important point to make, because we aren't taught, right, to question what was already pushed upon us before we were born, right? The given name, the gender identity. And I think it was a good reminder, even for someone like me, where I didn't realize for myself, right, that I could just pick a different name or introduce myself a certain way that I liked and I preferred. And I feel like it does give one, and I feel like it does give oneself a moment of empowerment when you navigate your own identity based on what you feel and what you like and what you learned about yourself, not what your family told you you should be. I think when you question things, right? Maybe some people are like, "Oh, it's just a name, who cares?" You question aspects of yourself like your name and you wonder, "Okay, like is this who I am? Does this fit me? Is this the person I want to be in this world? Is this how I want to present myself?" And I think it's important to ask yourself these questions.
Yeah, and I think it is an important conversation to be had where if someone says, "Hey, this is what I want to be called. This is the name I'm giving you. This is the pronoun I'm giving you." And for people just have such complete disregard for that. It's
Right.
just so that's so fucked up.
They're just like, "No."
I'll say it time and time again in videos where we discuss topics like this. I just have no understanding of the hatred that people harbor, where they're like, no, I refuse that. And I understand there's a part, if it's someone you know in your life personally, there might be a part of you who's like, okay, I have to condition myself again to say the new name or to say the new pronoun. But meeting someone for the first time and just completely rejecting who they are is just, I don't get it.
It's
Being
like,
like, well,
what's
I'm
that
looking at
quote?
you and I don't think that that is who you are, so I'm gonna go against it.
What's that well-known quote? It's like, tell the world who you are, not the other way around.
I don't know that quote.
If I I've heard it over the years. But yes, let the world know who you are. And I am jumping quite a bit ahead where I segue into this chapter, which is about George's cousin Hope. And we see there's a moment, right, where George's nanny is telling everybody, "Oh, Jermaine wants to go by Hope now," and they're transitioning to a woman. And I'm going to read a section on page.
I was gonna jump to this too, so it makes sense.
Perfect. 165, page 165. So it's in the middle of the page. Or should I start from the top?
You start where you want to start.
Okay. So George is talking to, a little bit of their narration is towards the audience, but also towards the specific person they decide to talk about, right? So here George is addressing Hope, and they're saying, "Secretly, I wanted to be like you." When one is a child that grows up with the feelings of both femininity and masculinity and no space to process them, one tends to go with the best possible reflection of oneself. For me, that was you. I was unsure if I was a boy or a girl or a science project, but I knew you existed, which meant that I, too, existed out there somewhere in whatever form that may be. So then George addresses the reader and says, "Story time again, then I'll get back to talking to you, my cuz." "Jermaine now wants to go by Hope," Nanny stated while we were on the porch one day. I had to be about 14 when we all were having this discussion prior to another one of Nanny's famous family cookouts. "Hope?" my mother asked. "Yes. Jermaine has changed his name to Hope Loretta Curtin." Hope I said that right.
I think so.
The family exclaimed in unison. "Loretta?" It scared all the birds out of the trees. I remember someone saying, Lord, if Loretta was here, she would whoop Jermaine's ass for that one. But then they all started laughing. Turning to page 166. I asked who Loretta was. It got a little silent for a second. Then my mom explained. Loretta was Aunt Margaret's daughter who died at a young age from an asthma attack. That's Jermaine's mother. Go in the house and get the picture album, Nanny told me. I think I have a picture of Loretta. I ran into her living room and grabbed a few of the albums before returning to the porch. I handed her the books and she began to go through them, smiling at all the old memories as she turned the pages. This is Loretta, she said finally. It was a picture of my aunt sitting on a car hood with my mother sitting next to her. They looked similar and were both grinning. That damn Loretta was my best friend. We used to be together all the time back then, my mom said. I found out that day that my mother was also Jermaine's godmother, meaning in the event of Loretta's death, my mother had been prepared to take responsibility for raising him. Although she didn't raise him, my mother talked to Jermaine regularly. She would get him gifts on his birthday and Christmas. They really loved each other. My mother took the responsibility seriously. I remember her saying, well, if Jermaine wants to go by Hope, then we will call her Hope. Nanny scoffed a bit at the idea. I ain't calling him no damn Hope, that's Jermaine. But my mother and her sisters just looked at Nanny with that cut it the hell out face. My grandmother was old school, and although she loved hard, she was resistant to some of the changes. Partly because she didn't fully understand what was going on. Partly because she understood the danger society posed to people who didn't fit a norm, and she wanted us all to be safe no matter who we were. But mainly she was stubborn and only wanted things on her terms. The Jersey City crew arrived later that afternoon, like they usually did, with a case of beer, money to play cards, and a readiness to shit talk. Hope got out of the car and I said, "Hey, Hope." She smiled and said, "Hey, Matt, give me a hug, baby," and I did. When Nanny first saw Hope, she made a face. "What's this about you not being Jermaine anymore?" Hope replied in jest. "Aunt Louise, I'm a woman, and I wanted a name that fit me, so I chose Hope." "You need some damn hope," Nanny said back. We all laughed hard at that, Hope especially. "Well, I'm gonna call you Hope then. But I may call you Jermaine still. I've been knowing you since you was in diapers as Jermaine. So it's gonna take a little time now. I'm old." Hope smiled and said, "I answered to both, Aunt Lou." "Okay, baby, now let me hug ya," Nanny said. Nanny always had bite. She was definitely not a person who was more bark than bite. She just sometimes also needed to bark to get it out of her system. It was her way of processing and still getting her voice heard. It was a great day for all of us. My aunts were all hyping Hope up with, "Okay, Miss Hope, and I see you, Hope." As confused and unsure as we were also proud. And I'll read a little bit more of George addressing Hope. They say, "Okay, cuz, I'm back to giving you your flowers now. So listen up. I was proud of how strong you were to make that decision to transition, knowing that society is no safe space to live in that existence. I wish that I could have been that proud to live as I was back then, but I wasn't. I was fearful of what people would think of seeing me with someone like you. I was already dealing with enough antagonism about my own sexuality. At 14, I wasn't fully prepared to be in public with you. But because of you, I knew that I existed. I also knew by this point in my early teens that I wasn't going to be transgender. But that also meant that somewhere out there were people like me. Being queer is a journey, one that is ever changing as identities that were once in the dark come to light. As relationships that once needed to be hidden come to a place of greater visibility." Just gonna read one more paragraph from this chapter. So George continues on and says, growing up with transgender people in our family was a norm for us, but an experience I haven't heard from many others. Nanny and my mother often say it just runs in our family. When I think about the number of queer people in my family, I remember the arguments people have about whether you are born queer or grow into it. I think the funniest part about that argument is that it doesn't matter if queerness is by birth or by choice. It is who you are, and no one should have the right to change that.
Yes. I think throughout the book, George talks about what a good support system they had around them. But they also do mention that although their family accepted them for who they are, they still weren't given the right tools to navigate that. And that's one of the main reasons George wanted to write this book, to have some kind of roadmap for other teenagers out there who are processing their identity.
So many people, part of the queer community, have felt this since they were a young child, and they didn't have the answers and they didn't know how to express themselves because, again, they're just trying to fit in and they don't want to be bullied and they don't want to be harmed, so they do try to fit in with society, but they felt this their whole life. So George was like, I want to write a book that will help people that felt like me when I was younger.
The irony is the white conservatives are pushing their agenda more than anyone else. They're over here constantly pushing religion, constantly pushing hetero norms, constantly pushing gender norms. It's ridiculous. And another aspect that George talks about, because they went to a Catholic high school, again, having religion forced onto them, and then also not having the proper sex education. And then even when sex education is presented, it's only presented in a heterosexual relationship.
Right. And we did want to segue into George's school years because they had an experience where their elementary school was predominantly people of color, and then their middle school was a huge shift to George being a minority and that school being majority white people. And we do want to get into a little bit of the history that is forced upon us that creates a biased narrative that tailors to whiteness.
So, chapter 5 is titled Honest Abe, in quotation marks, lied to me. And George talks about learning history in school, learning Black history and just learning American history, and how they kind of glaze over slavery. And one part of the book that I posted in is on page 94.
Right, because we see George explaining when they were in elementary school, they got to be they got to play Abraham Lincoln in a school play, and how basically explaining how they were essentially brainwashed to believe that some of our some of our founding fathers were their white savior. And it wasn't until George eventually went to a Black middle school where they got to learn their truth and learned more about American history that our school systems tried to hide.
So, in history, Abraham Lincoln is painted as a savior for freeing the slaves. And on page 94, George included quotes by Abraham Lincoln that aren't really made known. This is definitely my first time reading a lot of these quotes. And I'm not going to read all of them, but I'll read one of them. And it says, and this is Abraham Lincoln speaking. I will say, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And there are a few other quotes here, and these just completely negate the picture and the narration behind who Abraham Lincoln was as a president and as a person. And that's something that we see time and time again, how history is rewritten and the way that it's presented to us. We see that with people like Christopher Columbus. And again, it just shows how, like I was mentioning before, how white supremacy and white conservatives will push all of their ideologies and the stories that they want onto everyone else, and will block and ban anyone else from speaking their mind and speaking the truth.
Right, and we learned in one of the interviews we were watching with George, the interviewer was mentioning, I believe it was New Hampshire that was trying to pass a bill, or they did pass a bill, to, what was it exactly? It was basically saying that schools were forbidden to mention certain parts of history. I think like slavery, for example.
Trying to, again, rewrite history and only show the parts of history that make them, make the founding fathers look good. Like, there was no, you're not allowed, they try to say, like in this book specifically, that kind of defaming the founding fathers or defaming the presidents.
Right, and that's something that we even noticed as we went through our school years, how they painted America in a honorable light, where we were supposed to see America as the heroes.
And they still try to do that till this day, although the mask is slipping, the veil is falling, and we are finally seeing America for what it actually is. And to go off of that, I do want to jump ahead. Sorry, did you want to say something else around this chapter?
Just quickly, I just wanted to point to another part. It's another part of the education system that many people to this day are still unlearning. And I think this is another overall theme throughout the book, is unlearning what is pushed upon you, especially when you know that the narrative being pushed upon you is specifically tailored to whiteness and white supremacy.
Right. And to jump ahead into the next chapter, which is titled "You Can't Swim in Cowboy Boots," and George goes on to talk about how they learn to swim. But before I get into that, I want to mention on page 116, there's a paragraph that says, "Consider recent American history. After the integration of public swimming pools, pools were filled with cement or simply closed in predominantly black areas. This prevented black families and their children from learning to swim. This is the type of social pathology that runs through us. Find a flaw, deficit, or disadvantage in our community, and I could find a system that oppressed us and made it that way." And I think this paragraph is a perfect example of systematic oppression, because unfortunately there are a lot of white people who are kind of like, well, they need to just get over that. This happened years ago. We have equality now. Racism doesn't exist. Like, there are a scary amount of people who believe that and don't realize how many obstacles are put forward towards black people and towards minorities, And we see that even till this day with ICE and the police brutality. And there are so many.
And the education system. Not much has changed in our education system.
And we learned that a lot of these events were not that long ago. And even throughout this book, George talks about having family members who had to deal with segregation. And those people are still alive. We're trying to act like, oh my God, 100,000 years ago. No, it was not that long ago. And again, just to reiterate 1,000 more times, is just why we feel the importance to read novels like this. And I think there are so many people who would see this book, so many white people, cis, straight white people, who would see this book and not think to pick it up and would judge a book by its cover. Or maybe even if they did read the summary, they'd be like, well, this isn't about me and this doesn't pertain to me, so I don't care. And I think that that's like one of the biggest issues, is not trying to see life from anyone else's perspective. Because I'm learning so much that I wouldn't learn otherwise unless I went and spoke to someone. And sometimes people don't feel comfortable, especially around another white person, if I'm not gonna go up and expect someone to teach me how to navigate these things. And some people are not going to feel comfortable, and that's something George talks about a lot in this book, where they're not sure if they're in a safe environment, whether it's because people are going to be racist or homophobic. So again, that's one of the big importances of books like this.
Right, and then you think about, that common life saying, walk a mile in someone else's shoes. And I think reading books like this, it's not exactly walking in their shoes, but it's definitely educating yourself in what that looks like. We'll never fully experience what George is experiencing, right? As a Black queer person, but we at least get to educate ourselves on how to be a safe space for those that are different than us, and how we can use our privilege to speak up on their behalf.
Yes. And just to backtrack slightly, at the end of the Honest Abe um, chapter, George ends it with, knowledge is truly your sharp. Sorry, this is page 104. It's just a quick sentence I want to read. Knowledge is truly your sharpest weapon in a world hell bent on telling you stories that are simply not true. And just, again, the importance of reading, just the importance of fixing our current literary crisis. And just, we need we need critical thinkers. We need people who are questioning the system at hand and fighting it.
And unfortunately, we need constant reminders like George's story to put it into perspective, just how oppressive the system still is. Like you mentioned earlier, people want to distance themselves from the past and create that detachment of, oh, this was just how it was back in the day. And this is why I want to bring up another point we didn't get to talk about. When George was in school, do you remember this? Where their white teacher, let me find that page, sorry. 101. So George says, my worst experience with this happened when I was in 10th grade. We were in an American history class and going over the usual topics: Washington, Jefferson, and now slavery. Because even when my high school did decide to teach Black history outside of Black History Month, it was focused on the subject. Like clockwork, our syllabus went from slavery to emancipation, to the women's rights movement, to the civil rights movement, to the final refrain, quote unquote, look how far y'all have come. The difference this time around was that I was almost 16 years old and I had questions. As the teacher started describing slavery, he talked about it as, quote unquote, a thing of its time. And I took issue with that. You'll find that when people often use the excuse, it was the norm, when discussing racism, homophobia, and anything else in our history, that and anything else in our history they are trying to absolve themselves of. Saying that something was quote unquote a norm of the past is a way not to have to deal with its ripple effects in the present. It removes the fact that hate doesn't just stop because a law or the time changed. Folks use this excuse because they are often unwilling to accept how full of phobias and isms they are themselves, or at least how they benefit from social structures that privilege them. I'm gonna skip a little bit. George says, I pressed my teacher hard about why he thought it was okay to simply say that slavery was a thing of its time. Why didn't he see that people, white people, had made a choice to enslave another race? There were abolitionists who were able to see it was wrong, and Quakers who were able to see it was wrong. So why couldn't all white people see it was wrong? He responded yet again, saying, there were many things back then that wouldn't be accepted now. And then the teacher goes on to say that if they had lived during that time, they would have slaves. And the whole class went silent. George says, I remember how even the white kids looked shocked. It wasn't what he said as much as how he said it. So matter of fact. I remember feeling hot, like angry hot. When I get really angry, I usually cry, and I could feel myself reaching that level. Thankfully, I had a friend in class who spoke up first about her concerns, but it was as though he hadn't heard her. I finally composed myself enough to respond. That's not okay. It is not okay for you as a teacher to say that you would have had slaves. He kept trying to go back and forth about it before he ended the conversation by saying, let's just move on. I rarely felt afraid to speak up in Catholic school, and I honestly don't know why, other than feeling that if I didn't, then who would? Maybe it was partly teenage rebellion, but it was more likely the beginnings of the activist that I am today. When people ask me how I got into activism, I often say, the first person you are ever an activist for is yourself. If I wasn't going to fight for me, who else was? In turn, I became a voice for all of us that day. This is just another example of the racism George had to experience attending a predominantly white school and having such a dismissive teacher.
Right, for the teacher to be like, well, I would have done it too, instead of being like, well, I would have fought against it, is just wild. But again, that's just their racism coming out. They can't hide it. Like, there are certain people who are just so filled with hatred and ignorance and anger that it's gonna come out eventually. And I think we see that time and time again when people are like, oh, that's just the times, that's just what it was, that's just how things were. And we see that constantly in American culture, in TV shows, in movies, in books.
Right.
How much of that is rooted in racism?
And one other point I wanted to make that George states on the next page, they say, no wonder so many kids of color and queer kids don't feel they have the opportunity to speak for themselves. This double standard is called the school to prison pipeline nowadays. And it underscores how black kids are given harsher penalties for the same offenses as white kids. Back then, it was business as usual. Suffice it to say, when white kids spoke up, it was taken as non-threatening. But when black kids spoke up, it was clearly different. And this is where we have to remember the importance of representation throughout school staff, right? Where George experienced it firsthand, and I'm sure till this day, kids of color are still experiencing it, where they have predominantly white teachers and their race and their culture and their community is still being oppressed by having white teachers present a subject through the lens of whiteness.
Yeah, and we spoke about this when we discussed The Catcher in the Rye, how society felt like this is a book that must be taught, where I know eventually it did get banned for whatever reason, but that feeling, them feeling like that's an important coming of age novel, and not reading a book like Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, or now having a book like this be presented. And I'm sure there's countless other books that could have been put into the curriculum. Amy and I went to a middle school where it was super diverse. Obviously, living in Queens, New York, it's going to be super diverse, but our middle school was a lot more diverse than our high school was. And I think I saw a difference in the way things were taught and the way the curriculum was presented. Like, I remember in middle school reading Malcolm X autobiography, and like reading more about, I think we were lucky enough to go to a school where we had a diverse range of teachers, and they were willing to teach the proper history. I don't know if you felt this way. And then going to a high school that was more predominantly white, and just seeing the difference in the topics they were willing to discuss, specifically in history class. Like, we had an opposite experience.
And I can relate this back to our episode where we watched the documentary A Spark Story, where we had Afton, who is a Black woman who entered the Pixar space, right, and got to be that voice for the Black community and start incorporating that representation amongst the animation. Because if your staff is predominantly white people, then oftentimes the art is going to be catered to whiteness, right? And then Afton came in and started questioning that, and became that voice to represent more of that diversity, and to question, okay, why is this character white? Do they need to be white? And being that representation for her community, we need that representation among schools, because students from all different backgrounds need to see themselves represented in their educators, in their superiors. They need to know that they, like George said, like, I need to know that I exist, and they have to have people who look like them to advocate for them.
Moving on to a different topic of the book that I just want to briefly touch on, because it is a darker subject, because we're talking about advocating, and I think that that's one of the main messages George is writing throughout this book, advocating for so many different things. There is a chapter about sexual assault in this book, and again, I think that that's something that people are scared of their children learning about. And when we say children, this book is written for teenagers. And George says that they wrote this book for the ages 14 to 18, which are all of your childhood's developmental years, but those years specifically, when you're going through puberty and you're developing and you're learning about your sexuality and you're learning about your body. It's a scary time, and so many kids are going through a lot of different experiences. And we spoke about this even in The Bluest Eye, how there are adults out there who constantly feel like they're protecting their children, when in reality they're doing the opposite. I think lying to your children and pretending that scary things don't happen is actually harming them more than it is helping them, because they need to be aware of predators. They need to be aware that these situations could happen, because so many children are being harmed and they have no one to talk to about it, and they're scared to talk to anyone about it. And what we see in this book is George being told, shh, keep it a secret, don't tell anyone. And that happens time and time again. And till this day, we've spoken about this in other videos too, that predators are protected. And I just wanted to like briefly touch on that topic. We're not going to dive too much into it because it is, it is hard to talk about. And I know maybe even I'm kind of brushing past it, but it is it's a hard thing to talk about. It's difficult. It was the hardest chapter to read, in my opinion, for this book. But I do think it's something important, and it's something that should be taught, as well as better sex education. I think just as important as it is to talk about sex in a healthy way, it's also important to talk about the harm that could happen when someone is entering your space and doing things that they shouldn't, and just knowing that there is a safe space for you to go to and talk to someone about it.
Right. And like you mentioned, they another one of the reasons they banned this book was because there's sexual content in it. And like Mel was saying, the school system thinks they're shielding the children from this type of information, right? But they're seeing that throughout social media, throughout the shows they watch. It's intertwined in so much of what's created, right? Music.
Exactly, and especially the age of the internet, where kids have access to so much and there aren't parents that are monitoring what their children are looking at online. And like you said, the music that we're listening to and the music that's pushed onto them, and TV shows. And I was even mentioning to Danny how in high school I was reading Twilight, and there are sex scenes in the series. And there are other books out there that I'm sure other people can find and name where there are scenes either alluding to or directly stating sex, whether it's in a good way or a bad way. But children need to be taught the difference.
Absolutely. And Mel and I'm sure we've mentioned this in past episodes. We know how shitty the sexual education is in this country. I mean, we can think back to our years where there wasn't really education. It was more of a scare tactic when they did talk about it. And we just know that there's so much that needs to be covered when it comes to sex education that teens do need to learn about. And that was something that George wanted to do by telling this traumatic story, because they want this book to be a tool for whoever picks it up and to learn from it and to know right from wrong.
Right.
And we are going to wrap this up. There was one part I wanted to bring up. This will segue into a video Mel and I wanted to share to end this episode. So if you all will turn to page 97, if you're reading along. George talks about what they call the talk in a Black household. And I'm going to read a little bit about that. George says, "My parents taught me early about how you behave so that you don't end up a statistic. The talk is what we call it in Black families. Not about the birds and the bees, but about the dangers of interacting with non-Black people. Because they will assume the worst of you as a Black boy." I'm sure this is still a conversation that unfortunately is necessary in Black families, because we're still seeing the Black community being targeted, being killed, being oppressed, and it gets brushed under the rug. There's no justice. We're not seeing the justice.
So the video I'm going to show is by the creator IANLIGHTFOOT, and he talks about a recent story of a teenager named Nolan Xavier who recently was found dead after going on a 4th of July vacation with a group of his friends that were all white. And then the creator goes on to share countless other stories where a Black life was taken, and like Danny just mentioned, no justice was served, and it correlates directly to this passage in the book because, again, they don't know who's a safe space and who's not a safe space. They don't know that the room they're walking into is going to be racist or homophobic, transphobic. Because, again, this also goes on to so many other communities that are targeted. And we just want to, again, be the change we want to see and spread awareness as much as possible. And I know that even this video probably doesn't even mention the countless other names, but we want to at least put some of them forward. And the fact that this is still happening 2026, this week, this literally just this past weekend, we are filming this on July 7th. This just happened a few days ago. And again, just stressing the importance of stories and books like this, and just being advocates for that. And yeah, it's just it's exhausting and tiring, but I'm gonna play the video and then we can talk more about it.
You're about to see this boy's face and hear his name a lot the next couple days, and then unfortunately the majority of white people talking about it will forget all about it as they ride off into the sunset chasing the next headline, because at the end of the day they're allowed to put their phone down and stop thinking about it. Black people are not afforded that luxury. So before that happens, I would like to remind you that this is not an isolated incident. Nolan Xavier Wells died mysteriously on Horn Island this weekend while going out with his white friend group. It was reported that there was an argument, and now every boy that was present is saying they don't know what happened. Nolan is described as a special soul, always willing to cheer and uplift others. Cohen Wiley was shot by police just 3 weeks ago, 1 year old, because they thought his guardian stole diapers. Just 2 months ago, Juliana Nizita, 16 years old, was found hanging on a church's property after being missing for 10 days. Police refused to even perform a homicide investigation, ruled it a suicide, and never mentioned it again. Kyle Basinga was hanged in Georgia 3 months before that, and once again, police ruled no foul play. Trey Reed was found hanging in a tree on Delta State's campus in September of last year. Police ruled no foul play, but his family demanded a private investigation and independent autopsy, and they still have no results 10 months later. Denoris Richardson was found the previous September hanging in a remote area miles away from his home in Alabama, only months after he filed a lawsuit against police for beating and abusing him. Police ruled it a suicide, but his family and I believe it was framed that way. He was the father of 5 children and coached kids baseball and football. Javian McGee was found dead with a rope around his neck in North Carolina the same month, ruled suicide immediately by police. His family disagrees. In May of 2024, 4 white teenagers knocked on Justin Johnson's door and told him to come out while holding what looked like a toy gun. They said, "Justin, I see you in the window, come out." Justin told his dad on the phone, "They didn't want to chase nobody but me, and I had to run fast away to come home. Run away from them and come home." He was found lying stomach down and pronounced dead later that night. Trevante Schubert Helton was found hanging in Georgia in February 2024, ruled suicide. His family calls for a more thorough investigation. Yolna Lubrin was found hanging in Orlando in September 2023. Police claimed suicide immediately, but her family accuses them of of jumping to conclusions without a proper investigation. In 2021, Peter Spencer was invited to a cabin in Pennsylvania with his 4 white coworkers and was found dead on the lawn with 9 gunshot wounds just hours later. The shooter was let free because he said Peter was acting crazy on shrooms, and the 9 shots were out of self-defense. Tamla Horsford was found dead in a backyard after having a slumber party with her white friends in 2018. Police ruled it an accident, but her family's attorney said blunt force injuries and inconsistent witness statements strongly suggest homicide. Terrence Woods Jr. was in Idaho in 2018 when his white coworkers said he started acting strange and running away from them. He's missing to this day. 4 black men were found hanging in 2020: Malcolm Harsh, Dominique Alexander, Robert Fuller, and Omari Bryant. Are you recognizing a pattern yet? Whether they were abandoned, murdered, or hanged, police are systematically denying black families investigations and answers they deserve. This system was designed to protect white lives, and that is exactly what it's doing. Do not let police or media convince you that these lives aren't precious, and don't buy into the lie that it doesn't deserve our full attention. My heart hurts extra for Christine and Elmore today.
It's unfortunate that so many of these stories aren't being covered. They're not being talked about in mainstream media. They're not getting the spotlight it deserves so that people of all communities can come together to demand justice, right? They don't want these stories to be heard.
There's no outrage. There's not enough outrage. And people always have made the joke time and time again in history, like, oh, if it's a white blonde girl, then there's going to be a million media coverage. There's going to be a million medias covering this and talking about it, and the police are going to go full force to look for that person or find the killer. And when it's happening to the minority groups, they don't give a fuck. They don't care anymore. And it is frustrating. And even, growing up in a white family and growing up around mostly white people, I have been in those conversations where they're doing these mental gymnastics and they're trying to justify the actions if it's like a police killing, or they're trying to justify whatever it is, or they're, I can hear the conversation in my head. Thankfully, I've removed myself from people like that, but I can hear the conversations happening in my head of even this situation where they're like, well, what did he do? What happened? They're constantly trying to justify the actions, and there is no justification for it. This is a young kid. He's a kid. He lost his life, and there's count all these countless other people.
I do want to read one more page before we wrap up, because I think this further encapsulates our message. Well, you know what? It's George's message, but one that we want to echo on their behalf and on the behalf of marginalized communities. This is on page 298. When I say I'm not blue, I mean so much more than a color traditionally designated to represent boy. When I say I'm not blue, I'm referring to the blue on the police uniform my father wore. How I've watched too many in that same blue harm black and brown people. I know for myself that although I respect my father with all my heart, it is my duty to fight against how that institution has harmed us.
And that's something we didn't speak about. And there's so much more to talk about in this book. And I really encourage, if you haven't read it, to read it. George's father is a cop, and that is something George discussed in the book. And George also goes on to talk about their mother and their nanny and their grandmother and their brother. And there are a lot of beautiful, happy stories within this book. And we wish we had 5 to 10 hours more to talk about this. We say that in all our book reviews because we truly, if we could, we would go through this page by page in every book that we read.
Right. Every time we film the book review episodes, we're texting each other after, like, oh, I forgot to bring this up and we didn't mention this.
But there are happy stories within this, but we did just want to focus on a lot of the important messages that are in this book.
Yes, and I know, and I'm sure it wasn't easy for George to write this, but like Toni Morrison said, we're gonna circle back. If there's a book that you want to read but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And that's exactly what George did.
And also, just really quick shout out to this beautiful cover art. I see on the back it says cover illustration by Charlie Palmer and cover design by Cassie Gonzalez and Meg Sarr. And I just wanted to give them a shout out because this is beautiful. What?
Absolutely gorgeous. That was our book review for the month of June. All Boys Are in Blue by George M. Johnson. Again, if you haven't read it and you watch this, thank you, first of all. But go support George. They actually published 3 books in total, and I was telling Theo I'd be interested in reading another book by them.
Yes. Me too. And maybe we will in the future for our continuation of this book club. And for this month of July, we are reading 1984 by George Orwell. Because July is usually the month, like I just, mentioned, it was just 4th of July weekend where people are celebrating this country, even though there's not really much to celebrate. So we want to read a book that's, I'm not fully sure, but I think it's criticizing society, right?
Yes. George, I was actually on George's Instagram.
We're reading 2 Georges, George and George again.
2 Georges. Well, I was on George M. Johnson's Instagram, and they actually posted a reel speaking out against celebrating the 4th of July. Go support them, go follow them, go buy their book.
As always, there will be a link below to their Instagram and socials.
Yes, and I also want to link the interview we watched. I think that was very helpful. And I also, we've been trying to watch interviews, the last few book reviews, to learn more about the authors.
We will link those below. Did you just say that? Sorry.
We filmed longer than we expected, as we usually do.
As we often do. It's been a long day. Mercury's in retrograde. I've been saying it all day to Danny because I've been having issues with my microphone. If you don't believe, that's fine. This is if you believe, you believe. If you know, you know. Stay tuned. In our next video, we will be talking about the movie Obsession. If you guys have seen it, haven't seen it, it is available to purchase. So have a movie night with your friends, watch it at home. Very creepy.
Yes, we'll be talking about that and a few other topics we wanted to revisit from some of our past episodes. So stay tuned. Thank you so much for watching. We will see you next time.
Bye.